You're very welcome to Counterpoint. I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation in light of the rallies that have happened in Dublin and last weekend in Cork City with more planned. I can tell you because I'm getting insights that it's beginning to have an effect in the permanent establishment and in the political establishment. Note is being taken. There is an energy here. We mentioned it before, and it's now having an effect in government circles, and I think that effect will grow. And the reason for it is at the centre of this discussion. I have in studio tonight Keith Woods. Keith Woods, not the rugby player as you can see. Keith Woods, fascinating writer. I'm just going to show you his first book there. It'll come up on screen in just a second. And this is all about nationalism, why nationalism is a good thing. And I just want to read a little summary of his first book, which was Nationalism, the Politics of Identity. And it says, another thing Woods gets right is biological race. Multiculturalism, in inverted commas, ironically presupposes that we can harmoniously mix races in the same society because they aren't all that different. Race is literally a superficial matter of skin colour, inverted commas. But if racial differences are more than skin deep, then multiculturalism is doomed to create conflict. I have found Wood's essays on racial thought in Irish nationalism to be particularly instructive. And this writer, who is the editor-in-chief of Countercurrents Publishing, Craig Johnson, then finishes his review of the book by saying, I wish I knew as much about nationalism as Keith Woods when I was in my 20s. I echo that myself. I especially wish I had this book when I was young. Spending a few hours reading it would have saved me years of confusion and searching. So read this book and buy copies of it for promising young people. What a fantastic review to get, Keith. I just want to ask you about that because when you meet people in the street, you live in Galway. Mm-hmm. We'll get to everything you've done in just a moment, and you're asked, like in an elevator, what's the difference between nationalism and what we currently have got, which is centralisation, power moving up into global supranational organisations, and a kind of just a great big blob of humanity being managed from the centre as a sort of division for it. How do you describe nationalism compared to that?
Well, I would say the difference in the worldviews, and I think this is kind of the fundamental binary of nationalism versus globalism, multiculturalism, what we have now, is, our current social planners think that institutions make people and that they can socially engineer people, and that, if you give people, Western liberalism and this package of values that we have, that all of these differences will basically disappear and people are basically, fungible, interchangeable units. And I'd say it's much more that the people make the institutions. And so we should be very careful when we do something like, embark on an experiment of mass immigration that will fundamentally change the demographic character of our people. And, I think Ireland is so far behind on this in some ways. We're really sleepwalking into a crisis because although this is a very controversial thing to say here now, just to profess nationalism openly, if you look at the continent, the conversation is really changing. I mean, just recently, Keir Starmer, who would have ever thought that it would be a Labour Prime Minister to come out and say this? But he said that the open borders experiment, as he called it, is making the UK an island of strangers. And even in places, traditional social democracies like Denmark, is currently experimenting with remigration. They've left the European Council on Human Rights. And that's not because they were taken over by far-right ideologues. It's very interesting in that case. They have a left-wing social democratic government. And what's also interesting is they actually don't really have a far-right. They don't have street protests or this great kind of division we're starting to see here. They're very sane people, yeah. Yeah, and the reason for that is very interesting, actually. I think the BBC profiled it in a recent documentary. They asked the politicians, well, why don't you have these problems? And they said, well, we noticed people were getting a bit upset about immigration. So, the kind of the Scandinavian mind, they decided to look at this and just look at the data and take a very scientific approach. And what they realized is that, yes, mass immigration has created parallel societies. There's a very interesting statistic in that regard. And I think this gets to what you're talking about in the introduction there of fundamental differences between people that isn't about any kind of supremacy or hate, but just a recognition of incompatibilities, which is in Denmark. Migrants take far more cash welfare benefits than natives. And that's true in most European countries. But the interesting thing is Denmark, taking this scientific approach, actually decided to collect crime data, welfare data on first, second, and third generation immigrants. And they actually find that the second and third generation immigrants, who you would expect to be quite well integrated into Danish society, they've lived their whole lives in Denmark, they actually take more welfare than the first generation immigrants. And they actually have higher crime rates as well. I mean, the one statistic that stood out is the second, third generation immigrants have a murder rate that's 805% times the native population, and about double, say, their parents' generation. So the whole promise of multiculturalism and mass immigration, which is that you can take people that are coming from radically different cultures, radically different backgrounds, and if you just kind of present, Western values to them, it will be so irresistible, they'll become interchangeable Westerners. That hasn't worked out. And increasingly, you're seeing a recognition of that from places you would not have expected it in the past. Left-wing governments, centrist governments across Europe. David Cameron said that multiculturalism was a failure. Angela Merkel acknowledged it was a failure. Recently in Sweden, they have a huge problem with gang violence. And according to a police report from Sweden, 95% of gang violence perpetrators are of non-Western origin. And even the Swedish government in 2022... And
non-Western then, just so we're clear on that, we're not talking here about, when you're looking at when the Danes are looking at the data, are you talking about the data of non-Western immigrants as opposed to, say, what we've experienced here, Poles coming in, right, and Hungarians and all of that?
Yeah, that's what's interesting about Denmark is, you have countries like France where they very strictly prohibit collecting any kind of ethnic data on crime or welfare or any of these things. What was interesting with Denmark is they actually did break it down by Western origin, non-Western origin. And there's been some economic studies on this recently as well. And again, there is a very, it's a categorical difference. There was 2 studies on this, one in Denmark, one in the Netherlands. And it found that actually the Western immigrants to these countries are a net positive economically. But the non-Western immigrants, I think Michael McCarthy may have even mentioned this on your show, they're a net drain, sometimes in the 6 figures. And Denmark found a similar pattern, which was that second, third generation immigrants, children of non-Western immigrants are the biggest net drain on welfare. And this is a pattern that's repeated throughout Europe. It's why in places that were traditionally very left-wing, like Sweden, you actually had, in 2022, their prime minister, who's the leader of the Social Democrat Party that kind of created the Swedish welfare state, said that mass immigration had created parallel societies. So when I look across the continent, we're seeing a recognition of the problems of this policy and the idea that if we just take a colorblind position, if we pretend that these realities don't exist, then, again, magically people will just, wear the skin of a new culture and we'll see a total change to these patterns. And what I'm saying from this perspective is, no, institutions look the way they do because of the people that built them. Countries look the way they do because of the people that built them. Japan is the way it is because it's populated by Japanese people. If you replaced the population of Japan with Irish people, it would be quite different in character. And we're witnessing the same thing happening in Europe now. And all I'm saying is, we have to have an honest conversation about if that's a good thing or not.
But can I just ask you about that honest conversation and just Denmark? If we can pause there for a second, because if you put in juxtaposition what the Danes have accomplished, now I think they just take in they make about 5,000 a year of citizens, new citizens. And they have a very well organised society. We can see that from the outside. Now, they'll have their own problems, obviously. Sweden, of course, have huge problems, as you know. It's been described, and in one of my talks, by one of their MEPs in Europe as a low-level civil war going on in Sweden. But if you look at what we did, what the Dáil did on the 26th of June last year, where we voted to join the EU Migration Pact, which now means that another 15 or 24,000, I think 24,000 is the preparation, are going to come in per year from the area that we're just talking about. And the quota is going to be decided in the centre, by the bureaucratic centre, by faceless bureaucrats. Irish civil servants are just second level to them. They just go along and they're told what to do.
Mm-hmm.
and the Dáil itself seems to me to be just the summer help.
Yeah.
You know, and like the Danes had an opt-out
Mm-hmm.
from the Migration Pact, and they were looking at us through their fingers saying, what are the Irish doing? I mean, they had a plan, they implemented the plan, they looked at the data.
Mm-hmm.
We have no plan other than build them and they will come.
Yeah.
You know, the IPAS centres. I mean, it just seems to be chaotic.
Yeah.
And if you stand up and say it is chaotic, there's an attempt to try and box you off as a racist or use tropes like far right and so on. And although I think that's now wearing thin, but how can one account for the behaviour of the Irish government only 12 months ago and the opt-in to the EU Migration Pact? Because on any level, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, and that pact, I think, is more insidious than people realise as well, because some of the way this was being sold to people was, oh, well, actually, if you look at it, Ireland has taken so many refugees the last few years that actually if they divvy up the quotas fairly, which is the idea of the EU Migration Pact, is how it's sold as, well, it's not really fair that all of these migrants come to Italy and Greece and they have to deal with all of them. So really we should kind of share out the problem. But there's actually a clause in there that says that in the case of an emergency situation, the EU can set that quota to whatever it wants. So, okay, maybe it's a lower number now, but in the case of what they declare to be some kind of global emergency, you're talking about millions of migrants. And they actually have an example of some of the clauses that could trigger that. And it's things like climate emergencies. Mm. So if they say that people have to migrate in the millions because of climate change, then these people are legitimate refugees. And not only are they legitimate refugees, but you have a quota where you're potentially taking your individual share of millions of people entering Europe. So yeah, it's terrible policy. There's really no justification for it. Again, it's Irish politicians trying to be the best boy in class, going along with everything the EU provides. And I think part of it is, I think Irish politicians enjoy being able to pass the buck to the EU. Mm. So often when the debate around
we've international obligations.
International obligations, yes, this phrase. It's perfect because, of course, who do you blame? Who's to blame? Well, we have all these international treaties and the Council on Human Rights and now the Migration Pact. And yeah, it's a way to bypass the democratic mandate on this and just institute this permanently.
Well, what I find interesting when I went to look at it was the degree to which the senior certain group of senior civil servants in the Irish permanent establishment, became pawns of the UN in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them from 2013, 2015, and that's been driving an awful lot of the sort of strategic thinking at that level. But we are now in a situation where we're still driving forward on fulfilling the legal obligations around the Compact Treaty. We're going to get in another 15 or 24,000. There's a huge problem with IPAS centres. Clearly, the communities are not happy with it. And the government itself is now seeing large numbers of people coming out onto the street in peaceful rallies and demonstrations. How do you see that playing out? What's your sense of it?
Well, I mean, I think just on raw numbers, it's really inevitable they're going to create some kind of backlash. And if there's no political party and no media outlets to represent that, it's going to come in this more raw kind of populist, street energy form. I mean, most Irish people don't even realize the numbers of this, but we're increasing our population by 3% a year solely through inward migration, while we have one of the highest emigration rates in the world. And we're talking about, non-Western migrants. There's actually been a shift in our immigration policy where, during the Celtic Tiger, there was a lot of Eastern European migrants. Since COVID, a lot of Western countries have shifted to massive South Asian migration, especially from India. And again, we talk about the kind of conflicts this is creating. I think this is really inevitable. There's a guy in the UK called David Betts, who's a professor at King's College London, and he's an expert in civil conflict. And he has used the example recently where, you might say, okay, India is a more Western-friendly country, it's not bringing Islamism, these kinds of things. But he used the example recently where there were mass riots and ethnic conflict on the streets of Leicester between Hindus and Muslims over a dispute happening thousands of miles away. And Betts, who's a very serious scholar, is now warning the British establishment that he thinks there's a high likelihood he puts his expectation at over 90% that within a European country in the next 5 years, there'll be a civil conflict. And if you look at his reasoning for that, it's the collapse in social trust that is a consequence of multiculturalism. Now, in Ireland, we've never had, a kind of populist right-wing party. We've had this much more kind of parochial division between Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil. And I think that's creating a problem where people have very legitimate concerns about immigration. And the government has decided to take a position that is just absolutely hostile to any discussion of this. I mean, with the media as well. The media obviously has a big role. But there's no release valve. There's no Nigel Farage. There's no Donald Trump. There's nothing to the right of this great consensus. And so, yeah, we're seeing it burst out in all sorts of ways. And I think it's just an inevitability of this project.
Well, we seem to be several years behind. Sorry, the establishment is several years behind what's going on in Europe. When you look at it, the big shift in the sort of Overton window, I've mentioned it a few times in other programs, the acceptability of what the two political extremes are shifted more to the centre. In other words, because of the growth on the right. And it's interesting to watch what's going on in Holland. Are you familiar there? The main right-wing party is pulling out of the coalition and around the area of the compact treaties, the migration pact, as I understand it, and that's going to be one to watch. But in terms of the media over here, I've long criticised it for the last 4 or 5 years of it's just non-existent. We can't expect anything. We can't expect proper reporting about what's going on, and I'm talking about RT as well as the broadsheets. And also, there is an agreement between the NUJ and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees that any of the coverage that does come will not mention the ethnicity of the perpetrator even when there is crimes, murder on the streets. It's quite extraordinary that Ireland has changed in such a rapid period of time to become a society which is tiptoeing towards authoritarianism and ultimately towards totalitarianism, if it goes that far. Now, I think that people are waking up, especially across Europe, and we may see some change there. But there's nobody talking this, having these discussions outside, within the mainstream media. It's just not happening. And when there are things written, it's usually opinion writers, the same crowd all the time saying the same stuff, which is very dated thinking around multiculturalism and everything, and the Irish, we went all over the world. The Irish, and look, we had to put up with. But I mean, we integrated and assimilated in the societies that we went into. And it's quite clear here that there is not going to be integration and assimilation with a large number of the refugees, so-called refugees and asylum seekers coming in, a lot of them are just, economic migrants. And I find that extraordinary. And that's why I had that recent interview with the three influencers. I hate using that term because it's a bit demeaning, but to discuss this. But it looks to me that we're going to end up paying people to leave, because you can't just force people out at gunpoint. I mean, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, Denmark and Sweden are both experimenting with this now, where they're actually offering financial incentives for people to return to their homelands. And again, I think people should take that very seriously in terms of, think of who's running Denmark and Sweden. Like, this is nothing resembling the far right. These are very moderate, usually left-wing social democrats. And the fact that these countries now are moving to a situation where, in Sweden's case, it's very generous financial incentives, like 30,000, 40,000 plus help with finding a job, that people that move back to their host countries. Like, what would drive these countries to take policy so radical? And then you look here, and we're pushing full steam ahead with this project. And like, I've always come at it from, a kind of empirical approach. I studied sociology in university, and it's an interesting topic to me as much as anything. And really, if you look at data on this on a large scale, there's just no debate. You look at multiple surveys on social trust and diversity that have been done, the finding is always the same, which is that when you create diverse societies, there's a breakdown in social trust. There was a landmark study on this called Bowling Alone that talked about this phenomenon where people huddle into themselves. They stop participating in their community. They stop doing charity work. They stop participating with their churches. And this is really a universal phenomenon. Places where the most conflicts are in the world are the ethnically diverse places. Everywhere that has experimented with this has had downward social trends. And the trends that was talking about with David Betts, which is that there's a collapse in social capital, in a sense, you make conflict inevitable. And that is what would drive a left-wing country like Denmark and Sweden to start paying these people to leave. But like I said, 3% immigration per year, that's not something that is easily going to be remedied. And even if you could integrate these people at those numbers, it's impossible. So we are going to create parallel societies. We're going to create problems that will take a generation to fix, in my opinion. And yeah, the tragic thing is that there's just no debate or discussion about this.
Well, yeah. Can I just maybe move on then, if I can, because you were one of the early starters. I mean, you're not 30 yet. You're on the cusp of it, as I understand. But you started in 2019 in YouTube, and you got shut down by the algos in YouTube. By the way, which to me is a badge of honor, because when we look at what happened during COVID, and we now have all the evidence of the interference with the platforms by the establishment, going after people, targeting people, it was quite extraordinary what happened. You got caught up with that. So can you just talk us what happened there? You had built up quite a following, and suddenly it's gone.
Yeah, YouTube was my main platform, and a lot of, on things like X, maybe I'm a bit more polemical and controversial, but on YouTube I kept it very kind of academic. These kinds of discussions that we're having right now, I actually I didn't have any active strikes on YouTube or anything. But actually a US organization, Media Matters for America, which is a hyper-partisan left-wing pro-democrat organization. It's actually the same organization that cost Tucker Carlson all his advertisers at Fox News before he left there. They wrote a couple of hit pieces on me, and that was me wiped out. But
why did they shoot? I mean, why would you have come on their radar? What? Because you'd obviously built up large numbers then, and you were beginning to have an impact in the US.
Yeah, it actually came in the wake of. So I launched a campaign on X called #BanTheADL.
Okay.
Which is, again, it was to try and create this general pushback against censorship. So the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is the other big censorship NGO.
Okay.
It organized a large advertiser boycott of Facebook in 2020 after the George Floyd riots, and that led them to institute a lot of the censorship. It did a similar thing with Twitter when Elon Musk took over. So I launched this campaign. It went #1 worldwide. There was 100,000 tweets under this tag the first evening. Elon Musk acknowledged it. He said he was going to run a poll to ban this organization. As it turns out, I think he maybe cut some kind of deal with them. But the fact that I had this impact meant I came on the radar of the censors. And so I think it's a good example, really, because sometimes, leftists will say, oh, you got banned. Well, you must have
done something really bad.
Yeah, you must have said something terrible. You must have been spreading hate. But actually, in my case, I raised awareness about censorship, so censors said, hey, this guy is terrible, he needs to go. So, we talk about electoral interference and foreign interference. I mean, I think an American NGO banning a large Irish content creator like that is probably a good example of foreign interference.
And you locked horns with Twitter as well, I think, before Musk took it over and turned it into X.
Well, I was banned off Twitter until Musk took over. And again, it shows the nature of the censorship, and that I never was given a reason or a strike or anything. But it was. I mean, I think it's been a big positive. I think that's one of the things that's kind of spurred on the right here, is that the fact that there has been at least one platform with a bit more open space and dialogue. I think back to the Irish hate speech bill, and that was something immediately when I got back on, I started to raise awareness about, and it had been years in the making. And again, you look at the media, mainstream media had just never reported on what was actually in the bill. It's just, of course we all support hate speech laws, right?
Yeah.
And it took the people on Twitter to point out, hey, people of Ireland, you might be interested to know that there's a clause in this bill that says, as it did, that if you have hateful materials on your device, you have a offensive meme on your smartphone, that you can face up to 5 years in jail. And of course, that ignited the debate. It turned out to be hugely unpopular with the Irish people. Politicians began to, jump ship and backtrack as it was coming up to an election. And that to me is an example of functioning democracy. That to me is the role of what the media should be doing, is holding us to account, pointing out the potential scope for overreach in legislation, which creates public pressure on legislators. But without that space of, unpaid, mostly anonymous people putting that message out there, it would have went through completely undebated. And we'd have the worst hate speech laws in Europe right now.
Yeah. We're under pressure to try and tighten it up again. But you're absolutely right. It's all part of that tightening up of. Hate speech, of course, is a misnomer, as you know. It's designed to attack anything that is counter-narrative to whatever the government wants to put across at any point in time. Disinformation, misinformation. It's Ursula von der Leyen's top agenda. When she campaigned to become to renew her position in Europe. It's quite amazing that we're even having this conversation after everything we've gone through. But there you go. What seems to be extraordinary is that Ireland now is we are at the centre of a massive tectonic fracture between the United States and Europe on the issue of free speech, because we now run Commission the Man. In other words, we're supposed to regulate US technology companies' platforms like X at European standards, which are infected with this hate speech legislation throughout Europe. How do you think Ireland's going to manage that? Because I don't see how we can get out of that. We can't talk out both sides of our mouth if we're supposed to be regulating it. Something's going to break.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a report this week that representatives of the US State Department had meetings in Dublin with members of the government to express concern about the free speech rights of Irish citizens and European citizens because of the implementation of the Digital Services Act, which, as you said, is being done from Dublin. I think Commission the Man, their office has over 200 employees. But this is a very interesting rift that's being created, as you say, where we've gone full steam ahead with wokeism and with the free speech censorship. And you now have an administration like people like J.D. Vance coming to Europe talking about the totalitarianism that they're witnessing in Europe. So yeah, in many ways, we're quite far behind where the Overton window is moving. But yeah, this has to be implemented. And again, the kind of legislation, it basically, if you read it, it leaves so much scope for censorship and for what counts as hate speech and disinformation that essentially anything can be censored. I mean, I've seen posts, they're not illegal under Irish law. Yeah. They're not illegal in any individual European country, but because of clauses in the DSA, they're taken down where no one in Europe can view them. So it's just an extra layer of censorship that exists in this kind of, this legal gray area where you're not saying anything illegal, but it's too on the nose for Europe.
Well, what seems to be very interesting is that the American administration is now saying that they will sanction potentially senior civil servants and regulators in Europe if they interfere with the free speech rights of US citizens in Europe. And I mean, that to me is a red flag, But it'll be interesting to watch that develop. But I just want to move on a small...
I'll just say one thing as well. The reason, because I should have brought this up, the reason the US State Department launched this meeting is because there was a little publicized story. It's interesting the State Department picked up on it, because again, this is where, if we had a functioning media, this would be all over the place. But the Commission the Man, which is going to be in charge of regulating EU digital platforms, had a meeting with the Hope and Courage Collective. And if people are familiar with them, they were formerly called the Far Right Observatory, which is another one of these bloated NGOs, state-funded NGOs, which is essentially, it's like a group of 5 or 6 Antifa pro-immigration activists. And, they spend most of their time basically doxing and harassing Irish nationalist populists, people that didn't go along with the COVID narrative.
This is an Irish NGO.
Yeah.
One of the swarm.
Yeah. And it's state funded. But I mean, they're essentially just full-time left-wing activists. And so these are the kinds of people that we have, a service that's supposed to monitor platforms across Europe. This is the kinds of people they're consulting with. This is who's going to be making decisions about what happens to companies like Google and Facebook and YouTube. I mean, it's no wonder the US State Department was like, what the hell is going on in this banana republic? Isn't this stakeholder capitalism? I mean, in other words, it sounds benign, but it's not. It's very malign. You put aside representative democracy, you alienate the people, you keep them
keep them distracted with stuff. You don't have a functioning media, and you just get on with doing whatever you wish, where the politicians are completely captive to the bubble of the NGOs around them. It's really quite extraordinary, and I think that's what's going to fuel a lot of the people coming out onto the streets, because it's at the moment it seems to be the only, other than the collapse of the Greens in the general election. Roderick O'Gorman, I nearly called him Rhetoric de Gormas because I often do, who, by the way, single-handedly did more to encourage refugees and asylum seekers to come to Ireland than any individual, I'd say, in the history of the sector globally. I think it's quite extraordinary. He just held on to his seat. It just seems to me that something's going to break, because this can't hold. The Irish establishment is a few years behind what's going on in Europe. The media are not doing their work. They want to touch this. I already see it myself in venues cancelling potential talks and so on. I mean, that's ongoing. You know, you can see the censorship still there. The fear is still there. How do you see that playing out?
Well, we're certainly in a transitional period. You know, the state, the regime, maybe a better term, because the state encompasses so much now, with the NGO complex, has thrown everything at this movement. But in some ways, I'm quite optimistic. I mean, you know, even looking at your show, some of the people that have been on, these are voices that emerged very recently. And really came from nothing. They're like self-created kind of content creators. And I think the popularity of these people, like, you know, Michael McCarthy on Instagram is getting like hundreds of millions of views. Yeah. It's just, there's obviously an appetite for this. And we do have opinion polls that bear that out. I mean, 80% plus opposition to immigration. People that think immigration is too high. I think there was a poll in the Irish Independent last year that said 1 in 4 people would support what was termed a far-right party. And again, you have to consider that the way that question is being phrased to them by the people conducting this opinion poll, they use terms like far-right. It's inherently a bit off-putting, right? But there's definitely a base there. And so it's really a question now of organizing that, of making it coherent. And I think it's why it's great to see stuff like this that's you know, professionalizing this a little bit. Because there's a lot of reasonable people out there that see the things we're seeing, and that want to have it represented somewhere, and they just haven't until now.
Can I throw a difficult question at you? You probably haven't been expecting it, but is the what's very noticeable, I think, is the absence of something in all of this, and that's the women in Ireland. They're not at the forefront of the organisation of those rallies, which I think is something that the rally organisers need to pay attention to. They're not on the platforms giving talks, and they're not in the content creation area that we described. And yet, in all major political change, certainly in modern Irish history, it's the maternal it's the maternal Irish culture that has been a huge driver of change. And I think they've got, you know, if this is going to have to happen, I think attention needs to be put into that area. But is that something you've given any thought to?
Well, you know, I don't know what the magic formula is exactly that would change that, but I do think it is interesting. If you look at a place like France, actually, women support Marine Le Pen's party at actually higher rates than men, which is interesting. Often you see that the other way around with more right-wing parties. But I think, you know, it'll be a function of success, that when we start to reach a more general audience, that you'll have more women come in, because obviously women are very much more attuned to social dynamics, you know, the kind of the ethereal, you know, sense of where things are going. So I think when we start to see more women come into these ideas, you'll realize that the momentum really is there. But unfortunately, I don't have the magic formula to attract women.
I don't either. I just
or in general.
I don't either. By the way, and it wasn't a unique thought. It was put into my head by a senior person in the establishment around it. That put it into my head, that rang me specifically to make this point. I said, my God, you're right. You know, I mean, it's so obvious, and it's something that I think needs attention. Can I finally ask you, you know, we're coming up to a presidential election at the end of the year. The existing president, Michael D. Higgins, only referred one piece of legislation to the Supreme Court in 14 years, as I understand it. And before that, you had Mary McAleese, and before that, of course, Mary Robinson, who didn't even see out her term as president. as I understand it, in principle, what the President of Ireland should be doing is protecting, using the Constitution, protecting the Irish people insofar as he or she can against state overreach. But that's all we've been talking about. We've been talking about state overreach. And yet there's complete silence from the Áras on it. In terms of the presidential election coming up, what kind of character, ideally, do the Irish people require in the office of the president compared to what has gone before?
Well, yeah, I think you're hinting at it there, in that there needs to be someone that is willing to take a strong stand against the government. I mean, I know there is this idea now that the presidency has to be something apolitical. This is something that Michael D was sometimes criticised for, that he was politicising the presidency, as if it isn't already a political position by nature. But I think, even what we're talking about with the NGO complex, I think that's somewhere where you have the creation of a kind of deep state, an unseen, unelected state that's really answerable to nobody, accountable to nobody. It's the kind of thing that, De Valera and the people that drew up the Constitution, I don't think could have ever really foreseen. I think that's the kind of thing where you need someone like a president as a figurehead, as a representative of the people, to say, this is functioning completely wrongly. This is a complete subversion of the kind of republic that was foreseen in the Constitution that the president is there to uphold. And, even if he can't, through a piece of legislation, change that, I think there needs to be a serious conversation about the way our entire institutions are being subverted by that kind of governance. And so that's something I would like to see from a president, which that's not even necessarily, a super partisan thing that you need someone that's super ideological representing a certain side of the spectrum. To me, that's just a problem of a subversion of the basic institutions of our republic.
But if candidates step forward and they're basically cloned out of the sort of the blob, the kind of EU bureaucracy, MEP, I'm thinking particularly now Mairead McGuinness, for example, with Fine Gael, or they're coming from, they're a retiring member of the Una Party, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, that have been steeped in the development of all of this. They would be entirely the wrong character, for me anyway, I'm only speaking for myself, to have in the Áras, because they're certainly not going to stand up and say, well, actually, all of this that we've tolerated is actually needs to be unwound, because that's the kind of dialogue that needs to happen. Yeah, and
so I wouldn't be optimistic in that regard. I would look to maybe something like the family referendum that happened last year, where despite overwhelming political support, media support, the people rejected it. And that was interesting, because you saw that there was an attachment there to the existing constitution, to the existing way of doing things in Ireland. There was a skepticism about totally overwriting this for these progressive ideals. And so, perhaps there would be an appetite there for a candidate that would have a similar attitude to the government. But it's these things tend to be a big popularity contest, but we'll have to see what emerges.
What's interesting there, I'm glad you mentioned that, was my intelligence, because people contact me and tell me stuff that people seek serious people, but from inside that last year, just before the Irish people overwhelmingly rejected the constitutional change, that the civil servants would have been deeply concerned about the potential insolvency of Ireland in the event of it going through. It's something that hadn't come up at the time, that the actual mathematics around changing the definition of marriage and everything that falls from that through the social protection system and, for example, home carers and all the rest of it, that when you added all that up, it would have greatly increased the social protection state itself to a point that it would create an issue for Ireland. A financial, a budgetary issue, a significant budgetary issue, like a crisis. And I found that very interesting that they were thinking that way, but that wasn't being discussed publicly.
No. There was practically no discussion about that bill except what filtered through online, and even then, it wasn't really organised. But it was quite amazing, because I heard a lot of people just anecdotally saying, everyone I talked to is voting against this. Just in a very organic way, people became sceptical of that bill. It was associated with wokeism. It was associated with this kind of left-wing progressivism, or any mention of gender roles, of male-female, of the family has to be done away with. And so I thought that was cause for optimism, that there was kind of an instinctual distrust of that. And I think that would maybe be a good foundation to build on for a presidential candidate.
Well, let me put this to you then, because I'm just trying to join the dots here, right? So we had the constitutional referendum rejected instinctively by the Irish people last year. When we had a general election where there was a complete absence of an opposition party, they're still absent. They're playing it both sides of their mouths all the time, which is Sinn Féin. And then people were left with a disorganised growth of these new generation politicians trying to get through, not really understanding that it's a grind. It takes a long time to do that because the system is built to protect the incumbents, So therefore, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil do well, but they do well, I think, almost by accident, And I mean, to me, then the signal to me was the destruction of the Greens, with the exception of Roderick O'Gorman just barely hanging on by the skin of his teeth, and that to me was the beginning of what we're seeing in Europe, which is the beginning of the unwrapping and rejection of wokeism, because they were basically leading that. They were the tip of the spear inside in politics, but the NGOs remain.
Yeah, and that was actually a trend across Europe in recent elections, is Green parties being wiped out, because I think that's a positive sign in that they do represent the worst of wokeness in most people's mind. But I think the thing about Ireland is, although we don't have a two-party system, we don't have the kind of duopoly that keeps things very stagnant in somewhere like the US. In a sense, I think in people's minds there is, in that you really, realistically, when you're looking at what's going to form a government, it's going to be Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, or it's going to be Sinn Féin. And so in that sense, okay, maybe you vote for an independent, but you're basically choosing between, do you want the kind of progressive centre, the existing regime, or do you want the radical left? Because if Sinn Féin go into government, it'll be with this ragtag coalition of people before profit and whoever else. And so that's kind of the existing binary now. There are things, obviously, that are making Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil seem less and less like any kind of centre and much more left-wing. I mean, we have Micheál Martin is basically coming out saying nations don't exist and we're an island of mongrels now. But I think that's a big part of the reason, is as much as, there's understandable frustration with the Irish electorate constantly choosing these establishment parties. I mean, at the same time, the kind of realistic threat right now is Sinn Féin. So I think a lot of people are just voting against parties rather than voting for anything, because it just doesn't seem like there's a realistic alternative right now. Yeah,
Micheál Martin, to me, and I know him, from school days. He was a year ahead of me in school in Cláiste Creastery in Cork, and know him over the years. He's kind of evolved into a kind of what I call a liturgical globalist, kind of preaching something that to me is falling apart across Europe. And they're just, for the leader of Fianna Fáil, his antenna doesn't seem to be as well tuned in as one would expect. But we'll see how all that evolves. You have another book coming out, I think. You've done two. This one, the Nationalism, the Politics of Identity, then Irish Nationalism, Essential Writing. Tell us about that. That's a collection of Irish nationalist writing over what term?
So it's the 18th and 19th century. It was interesting when I sat down to put it together, because I assumed we had something like this, that someone had created something accessible that brought our Irish nationalist writings together. But it's interesting to see how neglected it is. I think maybe if you look at the quotes that were coming out from those Trinity College history professors about Ireland being a nation of mongrels, and I think that's maybe more representative of the academic view, and probably why we've had understudy of our own nationalist tradition. So that was the ideas I put together, the Young Irelanders, Douglas Hyde, Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, these kinds of people, and put it together in one accessible collection, because it's great to see people come into these ideas now.
And people can get access to these books on Amazon, right?
Yeah.
So they just... Okay, and then in terms of connecting with you or following you on social media, how do they do that?
So I guess X is kind of my main platform. Yeah. I've a couple 100,000 followers there. So
I think you have 230,000.
Well, if you want to be specific.
It's a lot more than me anyway.
Well, we'll give you a boost after this.
Okay.
But it's at Keith Woods, YT. I write on Substack. It's just keithwoods.pub. So that's where I publish all my content, and you can, it's kind of a hub for my content. You can find everything there.
And what next for you then? What more is in you? I mean, you've contributed enormously, in my opinion, so far. It's quite extraordinary for somebody for somebody is relative. I'm speaking now as somebody twice your age. It's quite extraordinary the impact you're making. I just want to see you do more. Without I know now you write. As I asked you off camera, you're writing up to 12 hours a day from what I can see. It's absolutely extraordinary output. And you just have to mind that you don't burn yourself out. But what more do you want to do over the next few years? How do you see that happening for you?
Yeah, the 12-hour days, it's maybe a bit of an anomaly. I can't profess to be that hard working. I'm working on a book which will look at decentralization and localism and some of the problems we've discussed in terms of this totally unaccountable democratic structure that we've constructed now, pseudo-democratic with NGOs and quangos and unelected bureaucrats. So that's one thing I'm very interested in looking at and presenting people real alternatives that do exist out there.
So a shift in power to local government.
Yeah, decentralization, skin in the game, I think is a great concept for politics. The idea that, Napoleon and Alexander, they used to be there at the front of their armies leading the charge. People used to face real consequences for failed policies. We've built an entire system. I think Ireland is maybe the best case of this, of it's just total unaccountability. You really see this at the local level. And I think fixing that would be an important step, putting accountability back in politics. I used the example, I don't know how much more time we have left here, but I used the example of Switzerland, which is a good example of this, that has power at quite a local level. And so it's a way to preserve the kind of local cultures, because it's quite ethnically diverse within Switzerland. But they actually interestingly took a referendum against mass immigration in 2014 using their direct democracy system. You just need 100,000 signatures to bring that. And it's very interesting because Switzerland may have headed the direction of other countries in Europe as far as mass immigration. The elite were very much in favor of EU integration. But this referendum, which was actually brought by a political party that had marginal support at the time, 1 or 2%, kind of a similar position to where we are right now. It passed despite massive opposition from the business community, from the establishment political parties. It forced the government within a period of 3 years to implement strict quotas, country by country quotas, to opt out of certain EU treaties. And as a result, Switzerland has avoided the worst of the immigration crises other countries have faced. And interestingly enough, the party that brought that is on 28% in Switzerland now. That started as one of these obscure, what would be called far-right parties here. It's the largest party in the federal.
I'm not surprised. What listeners, viewers will find interesting is that we actually had this direct democracy clause in the 1922 Constitution, which would allow the Irish people who are the preamble to the Constitution. The rest of the Constitution is us giving our instructions to the state and how we want it to run. Actually jumping in and saying, sorry, we have 100,000 people here behind this motion. We want that put to a national referendum. And because that would sort out a lot of coughs, wouldn't it? It would certainly stop a lot of the madness. What I regard and what a lot of us would regard as madness going on, like joining the EU Compact. That decision to me was beyond reckless. Way beyond reckless.
That's the pattern we've been talking about throughout the show. Is it happens on two levels in terms of the way Irish liberal democracy has changed, which is that the buck is passed in one respect where it's passed down to the NGOs. And it's passed up to international obligations, EU courts, UN human rights, and so on. And so you get something like hate speech law where they say, well, we have to pass it. We consulted with the public and wouldn't you know they were all in favor of it. And of course, the public turns out to be 50 NGOs that are supposed to represent these different segments of society that are funded by the government. And, they're full of people that have come through the university system, super left-wing in their orientation, reliant on the government for their funding. And, this is the function of our...
And externally, Keith, they're reliant on a lot of external funds as well. What's remarkable about that is that, and we just end on this point, is that it was Nick Delahanty, to be fair to him, brought this to my attention. And I have it in my talks that the only NGO that was ever stopped or closed down, certainly in the last number of years, was the NGO that was actually telling us where all the money was going, which was Benefax.
Benefax, I remember this. So
quite clearly, and that was the Uni Party deciding we don't want the public to see what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's quite a lesson there. It's a good point to end on. We got an organisation that basically just gave us complete transparency in where the money was going. and it was pretty much immediately shut down.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it on that note. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating romp around the whole thing. I feel there's an awful lot more to come from you over the next number of years. I can't recommend your books highly enough, and your engagement, and I wish you well with all your endeavours. And thanks for coming on.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Welcome. Well, there you go. That was a very interesting conversation with somebody that has a lot to say, very studied, great writer, great content producer. That's why he's got so many followers. Somebody that I think is going to have an important voice to add to all the other young people's voices, and I have a particular focus on that because I think that's part of the solution to get more people, especially young people, engaged in what's happening to Ireland, and this drift towards a kind of a totalitarianism of the 21st century with all the technology and the digital IDs and all the rest of it to go with it. You'll be hearing much more about that from Counterpoint. I can assure you of that over the months and weeks ahead. Thank you very much for listening.